Hello and welcome everyone to day 37, chapter 54. Today we're going to talk about community ecology. And in this first podcast, we're going to cover part of Objective 1. As we look at Objective 1, it's a pretty big objective. This first podcast will go all the way up from community to character displacement. And then the second one for this objective will go from predation to symbiosis. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with a working definition of community ecology. We can think of community ecology as all the species in a specific environment, so in a very particular area, that could interact. So remember, a population ecologist might be interested in a lion within a pride of lions. So a group of lions, the same species, but a community ecologist is going to be more interested in addressing questions about how that lion interacts with with other species. So things like the lion preys on the zebras, and that zebras eat the grass. We'll talk about this in a bit. We can think of even the zebras eating the grass as a predatory relationship where the zebras act as the predator on the grass. And then how the birds, or some of the birds at least, also eat the grass, so they go towards the grass, or at least I shouldn't say eat the grass, but they might nest in the grass. They might also eat the leftovers of what the lion doesn't eat. So the community ecologist is really interested in all of these living organisms that are within this environment of, as I described here, maybe like an African savanna. The next thing I want to discuss is this term of interspecific competition. And this is a term that we'll use to talk about two or more species use similar and limiting resources. So going back to our previous example, we had the zebras eating the grass. We had the birds nesting in the grass. You might also find other small rodents, mammals nesting in the grass. You'll find other animals eating the grass. So multiple species using this same resource, so they're competing for this same resource. Because of this competition for this similar resources, this can limit the population growth. Of the competing species. So if the zebras outcompete the birds by eating more grass, then the birds now can have their population limited. If another animal comes along and eats more of the grass and are better at it than the zebras, that's going to limit the zebras' ability to survive. We'll talk more about this last point I want to mention. That is, if two species, or it could be more, but we'll talk about two species. If two species have overlapping resources, then they cannot coexist. So let me explain this a little bit more. Indeed, you can have two organisms using the same resources, but if you have two organisms who completely overlap with how they use the resources and multiple resources, then one of them has to go. If that other species will, if one species will win in this battle of the competition. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, we'll talk about that now, in fact. And that relates to this term called competitive exclusion. And it's essentially what I just talked about, and that is when two species compete for the exact resources one will survive and the other goes away. And this could mean that they die, or they find a new ecological niche. I want to say more about competitive exclusion, but since we just introduced this term of ecological niche, let's go ahead and define it. This is the sum of all the biotic and abiotic resources species use. So if you have two species that use the same ecological niche, is another way we could talk about competitive exclusion, then at some point one of those species is going to win the battle and the other species will either die out or they'll find a new ecological niche. For them to compete at the same ecological niche, often the two species will have to be very similar. So it wouldn't necessarily include the bird and the zebra because they're not competing for the same ecological niche. They're both using the grass, but they're also both using other things too, and they're using the grass in a different kind of way. So I want to talk about a particular experiment where competitive exclusion was shown to be the case. So in 1934, I think that was the date, there was a scientist by the last name of Gauss, and he did this experiment with paramecium. And he took two different paramecium. So we're going to call one type A and one type B. If you look at the book, it'll tell you the exact species, but it doesn't really matter what the exact species are to understand the concept. But both of these parameciums were different species, but they were very similar. So they would use a very similar ecological niche. And if he did two separate experiments. In the first one, they were grown separately. In such a way that both type A had all the resources it needed to survive and type B had all the resources it needed to survive. So you can think of it this way, that there was two different flasks. Type B was allowed to grow in this one, and type A was allowed to grow in this one. And when he did this, what he found, so we'll draw this little graph. On this side is density, and on the bottom here is time. And when grown together, type A would grow something like this. Think about what kind of curve this is as kind of a review from our population ecology, and I'll tell you in a minute. And type B also grew in a very similar way. They were both able to survive, and remember, this is a logistic curve. Each of these organisms were able to grow until they reached the carrying capacity, and then they leveled out. Now in his second experiment, what he did was he took one flask and he grew both A and B in this one flask. So now both species A and B, very similar types of paramecium that use a very similar niche, and so needed the same kind of resources, were competing for those same resources. And so you could imagine a couple different scenarios. In fact, let's write down each of those scenarios. I can think of 3 possibilities before you did the experiment. Sometimes when you do an experiment, you think about what the results could be. And if you're like me, usually the 3 you predict, none of them work, and it's a 4th, which is always kind of interesting. But you could imagine that there's no change, that they both grow just as they would have independently. Somehow or another, they share in a peaceful way the resources. You could also imagine a situation where one of the species outcompetes the other, and the other dies out. In this flask, it would die out because it wouldn't have the opportunity to move to a new ecological niche. You could also, this is perhaps a little harder to imagine, where both of them grow really poorly and maybe both of them die out because their unwillingness to share this kind of common resources drives both of them to extinction. And what Gauss discovered was that this one didn't occur, this one didn't occur, but this one did. That they both competed for the same resources to the point where one of them was excluded. So we have competitive exclusion. The reason this one survived, type A, is because it was able to use the resources in a more efficient way. They might have been stronger, they might have been able to consume the food quicker, they might have been able to grow faster. For whatever reason, they outcompeted type B. And we see this in the wild as well, with different animals that are competing for those same ecological niches. So let's talk about resource partitioning. Resource partitioning stems from our last concept, competitive exclusion. Remember when I talked about competitive exclusion, we said when one species wins this competition and survives and is able to continue to operate in that ecological niche, the other one either dies out or it has to find a new ecological niche. Resource partitioning is a result of those other organisms, those who lost the battle, having to find a new ecological niche. To explain this, let's draw a little forest here. And we'll draw a tree like such, a lovely tree. We can draw a little pond over here. We could draw, maybe there's a human-made fence here. And what we find in this particular example, and this is an example where we're going to look at various types of lizards. And what we find is very similar species of lizards, not the exact same, but very similar. And we'll find some that live in the trees. We'll find some that live in the grass. We'll find some that live in these human-made structures. We'll find some that live near the water. We'll have some that live like up high in the trees, and then maybe some that live along the trunk of the tree. In theory, they could all really survive in any one of these niches. But over time, this particular species, for whatever reason, has outcompeted these other ones. And it survives best here. And these other ones, if you were to take this one that lives by the water and place it here, it would probably survive as long as this one wasn't here. So let's maybe give these some letters. So this is species A, species B, C, D, E, F, G. Well, let's get rid of F because that's the same thing as E. F. Let me say what I said earlier again, but using these letters. If you took species F and removed all of A, so let's just get rid of A for now, and you put F here, it would probably survive. But if you put A back here, A is going to outcompete F, and it's going to die out and have to find a new resource, a new niche to survive in. And eventually it has ended up here. Same thing with any of these environments. At this point, if you moved A and put it with F at the water, F is going to outcompete it. It has characteristics, it has adapted to this particular environment that A would be outcompeted with F there. So we call this resource partitioning. The resources in this general area have been partitioned. You can also think of resource partitioning not just in these geographical definitions, but based upon time of day that they feed. So you may have multiple species of lizards that operate in this niche, but they use it differently. Maybe one feeds at night, one feeds in the day. You may have species down here in D, multiple species in the grass, but maybe they eat slightly different kinds of food. Maybe they build different kinds of nests. Maybe one uses grass to build some kind of nest, whereas others burrow into the ground. As long as they're using the resources differently, they can coexist. But if they use the resources in the same way, they can't coexist. And as I said before, they either die out or they find a new way to use those same resources so they can survive. So this is resource partitioning. All right, let's talk about character displacement. This is related to our last conversation on resource partitioning, where different organisms have to develop new characteristics in order to survive because two species cannot coexist with the same resources. And your book talks about a really good example of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so I'm going to just draw 3 large islands here. And let's say we have 2 species of finches, and we're just going to call them species A and species B. When they're on separate islands, so if species A is here and species B is here, and they've developed into these 2 separate species because of allopatric speciation, because you have this big waterways between them and they can't move back and forth, so they form these 2 new species. They're not competing for the same resources, and because of that, when they're on these islands, and let's number these islands, let's call this island 1, this island 2, and this island 3. So on island 1, the beak size of species A is between roughly 8 and 11 centimeters. And remember, the size of the beak is proportional to the kinds of food they eat. On island 2, species A doesn't exist, but species B does exist. And they have a beak size roughly a little bit bigger than 8, but we're going to go 8 to 11 centimeters. They're slightly bigger, but they're about the same size. And again, they're allowed to have these same characteristics because they're not competing for the same resources. We don't have a situation of competitive exclusion here because they're operating in different resources. However, when you take these 2 species and you put them on the same island, say island 3 here, now they're competing for the same resources. And we know because of the competitive exclusion theory that one of these species is going to win this competition and survive and won't have to adapt. The other species, however, will either die because they can't compete, or they will have to develop, they will have to adapt to a new niche. And so this is what we characterize as character displacement. These characteristics have to change a little bit so they can both coexist. And on island 3, species A has a beak size of around, on average, 8 centimeters. It goes from, well, let's just write 7 to 8 centimeters. So it's a little bit smaller, but it's within this range. Species 2 here, species B on island 3, it will have a beak size on average of about 12 centimeters, but it goes from roughly 11 to 15 centimeters on island 3. So because they're competing for the same resources, for whatever reason, species A is a little bit better at competing against species B on this island, and so its beak size didn't change too much. Whereas species B on this island, as it's competing with species A, had to adapt. It had to develop characteristics that allowed it to survive in the same environment as species A. And we call this character displacement. So you should be familiar with these three terms, all the terms we talk about, but sometimes these terms get mixed up. So I'm going to write them here. We have competitive exclusion, resource partitioning, and then what we just talked about, character displacement. Competitive exclusion means that two species cannot coexist in the same niche. So species A and B, they cannot coexist and operate in the same niche. When this happens, when they're trying to compete for the same niche, what will happen is that we'll see resource partitioning. One of these species will have to operate in a new niche, or they may both but maybe both be forced to operate in new niches. So they partition this common resource so that they can each use it and each survive. They do this resource partitioning by displacing their characteristics, so character displacement. They adapted by having different sized beaks so that they could both utilize the same resources, or I should say they could both operate in the same area and use different resources to work in different ecological niches. This ends this podcast. If you have any questions, please let us know.